thank all of you for joining us here today. It's a pleasure to give this very brief and very general introduction to carbonate replacement deposits. So let's start with a little CRD history. So going back to about 483 BC, about 50 kilometers south of Athens, the Lavrion mining district, which means place of silver in Greece. Between 483 and 322 BC, this district produced 160 million ounces of silver from shallow surface workings. That silver paid for the fleet that defeated the Persians in 480 BC and allowed the blossoming of Athenian democracy. So very simple logic tells us that silver from Lavrion CRDs underpinned Athenian society. Athenian culture is the foundation of Western civilization, so ergo CRDs are the foundation of Western civilization. Now that might be a little bit of an overstatement, but not too much. And from an investor standpoint, with South 32 paying $1.3 billion for the Taylor Hermosa project here in Arizona, CRDs are now the foundation of major new investment interest. So much so that we now have hit the big time. We have our own Wikipedia page, which didn't exist 5 years ago. So let's start by talking about what is a CRD. So we're all talking the same language. So they're hosted in carbonate rocks. That means limestone or dolomite. Mineralization is dominated by the replacement process. We'll talk about what that means. They're intrusion related, so they're related to intrusive magma bodies. That means they're high temperature deposits up higher than 250 degrees C. They're epigenetic, which is a fancy way of saying they're younger than the rocks that they occur in. They're dominated by sulfides of silver, lead, zinc, copper, gold, and iron. Of course, pyrite and pyrrhotite are important ingredients. Mineralization is continuous from the source intrusion until the system runs out of gas. Big CRDs are polyphase evolving systems, and that means you get complex overprinting from the different stages and very large scale zoning. So here's our simplified CRD skarn to porphyry continuum model. So you have an intrusive stock here, which may be barren, or it may be a productive porphyry copper or porphyry molybdenum deposit. Surrounding that, where it's emplaced in carbonate, shown in blue, you have skarn, which is simply high temperature alteration caused by fluids emanating from that intrusive stock. And that affects the limestones around and tends to follow the structures and the dikes that are thrown off from that intrusion. That gets overprinted by the sulfide minerals that we care about, the lead, zinc, silver, copper, gold. So you get mineralized skarn near the intrusion, and then as you work your way outwards, they transition into massive sulfide. So no skarn minerals, just lead, zinc, silver, copper, gold sulfides in the form of mantos, which are kind of parallel to the bedding, or chimneys, which are big high-angle pipes. If there's unreactive rocks on top where the system passes into those rocks, mineralization occurs as veins. And above the central intrusion, you have veins, all kinds of alteration, the same kind of thing you'd look for if you were exploring for a porphyry copper. So why do we look for these things? They're big. And this is the CRD portion, 10 to 150 million tons. They're high grade, 5 to 50 ounces per ton silver, 3 to 25% zinc, 0.2 to 5% copper, and gold credits are common. Now, these metals are present essentially throughout the system, but the proportion of which metal is dominant changes depending on distance from the intrusion. Typically, these are mined underground at very low cost. They're metallurgically docile, so it's easy to get the values out. And they have a minimal environmental footprint because a lot of your waste rock simply goes back underground, and you're getting a lot out of your concentrates. Importantly, in today's world, many CRDs are well endowed with strategic metals. Zinc, being an integral component of all CRDs, is probably the most important of those, but manganese is also present and also very important. In addition to those, depending on the system, you can have byproduct credits of tin, tungsten, indium, gallium, and germanium. And if the deposit is placed in the right kind of rocks, The systems tend to incorporate things like nickel, cobalt, chromium, and PGEs. These are all important economically, but in the United States especially, these are also important as giving you fast track on permitting, which can mean it's a lot faster to get from discovery into production. So if you follow CRDs, those may lead to large volume skarns and ultimately, in many cases, a productive porphyry. Here is the Bingham Canyon system in Utah. You'll see this picture again. Everyone knows it's one of the great porphyry deposits, but surrounding that porphyry core was very high-grade copper skarn, and around that was lead, zinc, silver, CRD style mineralization that was mined for decades before they even thought about how to mine the copper. So this is what we mean when we're talking about taking an ore system or a district scale approach. We want to understand the entire system, not get stuck on a small piece of it. Let's look at some of the economic metrics of the different zones. So if we're out here in the Monto and Chimney system, again, 10 to 150 million tons, 300 to 1,500 grams silver, 8 to 30% lead, 5 to 30% zinc with a trace of gold and copper. So that means out here you're talking ores that are worth $250 to $500 a ton in these spaghetti-like or linguine-like bodies. As you get closer to the intrusion into the skarn zone, your tonnage goes up 10 to 450 million tons. Your grades go down. Silver's down to 60 to 125, lead's to 1 to 4%. Zinc is holding nice and strong at 4 to 15. Your copper's starting to come in strong here. You start to see consistent gold. This material is only worth $80 to $200 a ton, but your ore bodies are much more compact, they're much larger, so your mining costs are lower. So you can mine these by bulk techniques that are lower cost than you can mine these. And of course, once you get into the porphyry, you're talking 1 billion tons of 0.5% copper. That's $40 rock with a little bit of silver and gold credit, and you mine those in an open pit at the rate of several 100,000 tons a day. Important to note that between skarn and CRD, that's a continuum. If someone's saying, "Oh, we have a skarn deposit, we don't have a CRD," or "We have a CRD, we don't have skarn," that's just not paying attention to the full continuum that these deposits can show. Historically, CRDs had a bad exploration reputation. This is the outcrop of the Nika deposit in Mexico. This is basically the whole thing. There's not very much to see there in outcrop. This is what Nika looks like. 88 chimneys, total of 55 million tons produced, and that surface expression was just sitting right there. Took some thinking to get to find the rest of that system. Fortunately, in the last 20 years, we've come up with some real advances in CRD exploration. We understand where they are, what the regional controls are. We recognize this continuum from CRD to skarn to porphyry. We now recognize that there are mappable large-scale alteration halos that have geochemical and isotopic signatures that we can use to find the center of the system. We recognize large-scale coherent zoning. We can tell the outcrops of big systems from the outcrops of small systems. And in the drilling programs, near misses are more recognizable. The proof of this is that blind discoveries are being made. And you're going to hear about some of those here in a minute. CRDs and porphyry coppers tend to form coherent regional clusters. So you want to be exploring in one of these clusters and learn from the characteristics of the known deposits in those areas what your deposit is most likely to look like once you finally find it. If we look at the Mexican CRD belt, this is 2,200 kilometers long, up to 200 kilometers wide. The red and green both reflect CRDs. The red are the big ones. You don't need to be an exploration geologist to go, if I'm going to look for CRDs in Mexico, I'm going to follow this belt right here because that's where the big ones are. And if you do that and you focus, you can turn something like this, which turned out to look like a small deposit, into what is probably one of the biggest CRDs ever found in Mexico. So quickly, what is replacement? We've talked about it being related to an intrusion. That intrusion, as it cools, kicks off ore fluids, and those are acid, they're saline, they're hot, and they carry the metals we care about, fluorine, silicon, sulfur, etc. Those fluids migrate some distance until they encounter carbonate rocks, which are shown here in blue. The yellow rocks are unreactive rocks, and that carbonate is a buffer. So you have alkaline carbonate, acid fluids. It's like dripping vinegar into baking soda, like your kids do, and see that neutralization reaction. So that fluid simultaneously dissolves a little bit of the carbonate and immediately deposits sulfides and the gangue minerals in that micro space that's created through that dissolution. We call them replacement because you can still see the original textures of the rocks, even in places where the rock has been completely converted to mineable mineralization. Structural controls are everything to these deposits. Because the fluids react so quickly with limestone, where they encounter the carbonate, that's where mineralization occurs. So everything happens on faults, fractures, and contacts. As you work your way from the ore fluid input, the structural controls become increasingly subtle. So in the proximal zone, everything happens right on the structures, the big structures. As you work your way outward, less important, apparently, controls deviate those ore fluids. And you can use this overall shift of sort of erratic mineralization back toward tightly controlled mineralization as an exploration vector to lead you back towards the source of the system. Systems evolve in time and space. It's a multi-stage repeating process. Some of those stages are stronger than others, so you get superimposition of one stage after another on top of each other. This gives you highly complex textures. That sounds scary, but the complexity itself is a favorable feature. It's zoned with respect to the fluid channels in the system source, so you can use complexity to trace back to the source of your mineralization. You can even pick this up in outcrop in the distal-most parts of the system in the alteration. You don't have to be a geologist to see that there's 4 or 5 different stages that have affected this rock, all essentially controlled by the same structure. As a geologist, we consider something like this a really exciting thing to see on the surface early on in your exploration of one of these systems. Continuity is really important in CRDs. Mineralization is continuous from the source until wherever the system ran out of gas. So unless you have post-mineral faulting that offsets your pathway back to the source, you should be able, once you latch onto that mineralization, to follow it back to the source. And knowing that, even if you come to a fault, you should know it keeps going on the other side of the fault. So I just have to keep looking there. So we have, once again, we have our model here showing our intrusion with the skarn and the massive sulfide zones. Bingham Canyon being an excellent example of one with a productive porphyry at the center of the system. We can go to a system like Leadville in Colorado, shown at the same scale, similar style of mineralization, and this is sensitive. And an intrusion center, which is about the same size as the porphyry at Bingham, but it's not mineralized. Important thing to point out is when you're looking at one of these as an entire system, you want to make sure you're not getting stuck on a small piece of it as opposed to the larger coherent zones of mineralization. So again, this is what we mean when we're talking about ore systems or district scale exploration. We're trying to understand the entire integrated system to make sure we're working in the best place. Good way to look at these is as a spectrum, as the continuum from mineralization in the porphyry, shown here, mineralization in contact, skarns in contact with barren stocks, skarns associated with dikes and sills moving gradually out into massive sulfides. If you find yourself out here, you have this vector to go for exploration. If you find yourself with a porphyry and a carbonate rock, you have all of this to work with. Important to note that the really big systems cover a large part of the continuum. So this gives you a very useful tool for getting and staying focused in the system. The 5 systems you'll hear about today plot up here. Most of them are out here with the distal high-grade lead zinc silver zones, and they have the potential to work their way back towards this. Deer Trail has the advantage of having something in the intrusion, something in the middle, and something in the end. So they just have to link these stages together. So exploration is not dead. It's really vibrant in these systems, but one of the first things we want to know is the system a giant or not? These are not easy systems to explore. They're very worthwhile, but you want to know, am I in giant country? And working with these systems for 40 years, we've generated a checklist of 13 features that are common to all known large CRDs. And the 3 that you want to be able to check at the very beginning are location. So this is like real estate. You want to be on Main Street in CRD or Porphyry Belt. You want to be at the top of the carbonate section. That gives the system room to grow. And pretty early on, you want to see high-grade silver and then several of these other elements. First of all, it tells you really are in a CRD system. Secondly, it's telling you you're in a well-endowed CRD system. If you can check those 3 boxes, then you start worrying about the other 10 on the list. And as you explore, check those off periodically. Very simple-minded way of looking at exploration. If you find yourself out here, you're looking for that source. If you're at the source, you're looking outward. And as I mentioned before, the best of all possible worlds is to have a piece of the distal part and know where the proximal part is, because then you can work both ends against the middle. This is why it's so important for systems that are being explored from the distal part to spend a fair amount of effort trying to figure out where that center is, because it focuses you. It gets you an exploration corridor that you can work in. There are no one-armed big systems. So when you look at these overall CRD districts, you sort of have 2 examples, 2 extremes. One I call the skeletal hand model, like Setiaulalia or Tintic, where you have a whole series of these parallel mantos that coalesce back into chimneys in this area. So strong parallelism to the ore bodies. Or you have the Bingham or Leadville style, what we call the hub and spoke, where you have the central porphyry hub, and then you have all these spokes coming off it. But again, these systems have multiple spokes. If you find yourself in one, you want to make sure you're in the best one, and you want to see how many others exist to keep looking for. Again, you want to see people focusing on the cracks, because that's where the fluids move at all scales. An important aspect of this is the exhaust of that replacement reaction. So when that ore fluid dissolves the carbonate and deposits sulfides, that carbonate is not destroyed. It's picked up in the residual ore fluids along with whatever residual elements happen to be in it, and continues to migrate along the permeability network outboard of that, and then redeposits as what we call fugitive calcite. It used to be here, it's escaped out here. A lot of that fugitive calcite will incorporate manganese into its chemical structure, which makes it highly fluorescent. And this transforms something like this, where you see a whole bunch of calcite veins in the carbonate, which could be related to a non-ore related system or not, but you hit it with a shortwave ultraviolet light and it pops like this. This is we call this barbecue rock, because when it's really good, it looks like you're ready to throw the steaks on. And if you're this close, you're probably ready to pop the cork on the champagne too. So this is a relatively recently recognized system that tells us we're in a CRD system. We're in the exhaust plume of that CRD and can work our way back towards the source. And if you look at an example from Deer Trail, for example, and Lex will talk about this again in a minute, here's your core wet. That's 20 some odd meters of core. It doesn't really look like very much, but you put it under shortwave ultraviolet and you see this beautiful transition from blue to starting to pick up oranges and reds in multiple stages of overprinting orange and red. That's telling you multiple stages of fugitive calcite. And we know there's sulfide right here. So this has because the next boxes in both of these cases hit massive sulfide. So what we have is a recognizable zoning pattern working our way outboard of mineralization that expands our target by at least 20 meters. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of near miss scenarios. So we always want to think bigger, and we have focused for years. People have focused in the Western US, South America, Mexico, but CRD belts exist running through Eastern Europe and all into Asia. China's full of them. And we can track things like the Cordilleran belt to the northwest up into northern BC and on into Alaska. And you're going to hear those stories here in just a minute. But these are worldwide deposits. You just want to be in the best elephant country you can find. And with that, I will say muchas gracias.